Hosting me today. I feel like I've taken up way too many seminar series sessions over the past years presenting here, but at least today I'm not talking about election fraud, so I guess that's good news. What I'd like to talk about is legitimacy crisis, breakdown, and renewal, and present a book that has generated more questions than it has answered, unfortunately. Well, so this is the book, Myth and Reality of the Legitimacy Crisis. Came out with OUP last year. It's an edited volume bringing together a number of leading scholars around Europe. And we're trying to look into this topic of legitimacy crisis, and we're making a very unpopular argument, namely that we don't find that much evidence for crisis, which is of course a strange argument to make in current climate. So I'll unpack it a little bit more in today's presentation. So are we in a legitimacy crisis? The eternal question. How would we know if we are in a crisis? So I would just like to reason through a little bit what we think of when we think of crisis and what the implicit assumptions seem to be when we talk about legitimacy crisis. Then have a bit of a look at the empirical evidence. And as you will see, we can question that evidence as well. And then go into what is wrong with theories of legitimacy decline and what new explanations can we find that account for the empirical patterns that we do find. And then finish on what are we missing, which is all the puzzles that I have left around this topic, which you maybe might help answering. All right, so are we in a legitimacy crisis? Well, looking at these pictures, of course, most people would say yes, right? We've got, I don't have to enumerate them all, but we've got Trump, we've got Brexit, we've got people protesting in Spain, in Greece, in the US, etc., etc., rising support for left-wing and right-wing populist parties across Europe, Brexit and Trump, increasing support for authoritarian alternatives, as Roberto has shown. So it seems to be that, yes, at least something is going on. But if we look at empirical research on legitimacy crisis, actually, we find quite opposing findings. So if you look at the major books that came out on this topic in the last 2 decades, we find, on the one hand, people like Russell Dalton consistently claiming, and Philip Schmitter, yes, there's a crisis of legitimacy. By almost any measure, public confidence and trust in politicians, political institutions has eroded. Whereas on the other side, we have other scholars like Pippa Norris and Butch Newton, for example, saying, well, no, actually, if we look at public support over time, we don't find so much evidence for a crisis. So given this situation where almost everyone seems to agree that we are in a legitimacy crisis, why do we find these opposing statements in empirical research? Just to take a step back, to evaluate legitimacy crisis, how do we know if we are in a crisis? Well, we first have to define what is legitimacy, then think of how we can measure it, and then think through what constitutes empirical evidence for legitimacy crisis. So what kind of evidence would we think indicates crisis? So just briefly, what is legitimacy? It seems to be, looking at the definitions made in political science, that legitimacy could be characterized as the normative justification of political authority. So citizens believe that political authority in some way conforms to their own moral principles, their own sense of what is right and proper. That implies, if we conceive of it as the normative justification of political authority, that legitimacy judgment require a comparison of the normative principles that people have in mind about what constitutes just authority in their view to the real existing authority. So if we make judgment as people regarding legitimacy of our authority, we have these two things in mind, right? We have the ideal, what we would like it to be, we have our experience of the practical situation, and the comparison of the two will indicate whether or not we have a legitimacy gap or a legitimacy deficit. Of course, the problem is that we rarely ever measure those norms, so we don't really have a very good idea of what citizens ideally would like political authority to be or to do. So if we conceive of legitimacy as that comparison between ideals and the reality, The problem is that citizens' normative ideas about ideal democracy, what democracy should be, are likely to be different. Also, citizens' empirical evaluations of real democracy, how democracy performs, are likely to be different. So, if the only conclusion we can draw is that ideals in practice are unlikely to match for all citizens all the time. Which means that ideal democracy rarely matches real existing democracy, and we will always, or we're likely to always find gaps for at least some citizens. So democracy is bound to always make at least some citizens unhappy. And the good thing is, as Markov points out in this beautiful article on democracy as a moving target, that gap between ideal and real is a recurring catalyst to change. So this is how democracy improves over time. By again and again citizens pointing out, you're not representing me, this has to change, and the system change, and there's a new gap occurring. And so it's this continuous moving target. But what this means is that legitimacy will always be contested by at least some citizens in a democracy, right? So how do you recognize crisis? If legitimacy is always contested by at least some citizens, how do we know when it's sufficiently contested to become a crisis? And really, we don't have answers. We don't have answers to this. We don't really think about this, I think, when we do empirical research. But how many people need to be unhappy? How unhappy do they need to be, and for how long? Do we get worried if 20% of the population is unhappy? Do we get worried if 40% of the population is unhappy? At what threshold do we start proclaiming that we have now shifted from a problem into a crisis? And I think we often, as empirical scholars, we often just conveniently pick the one indicator that we feel is sufficiently worrying to be, and then we can proclaim crisis, and then we get more attention for our work, right? So let's get to measuring legitimacy, right? We don't have an answer to this, but these are some of the indicators that should indicate legitimacy crisis. In empirical research, and this is another problem to which I'll return in the conclusion, legitimacy is measured as political support. So there's quite a leap there from the concept to political support, which is, I think, problematic because political support collapses this ideal and real evaluation, right? But okay, that's the data we have. So if we want to measure legitimacy crisis, we're going to have to use political support for the time being because better data is being developed. But if we measure legitimacy as political support, democracy is legitimate when political authority is based on citizen support. That makes sense, right? But there again, how many citizens, how strong and stable should their support be? So in a lot of the empirical work on legitimacy, roughly these seem to be the assumptions of when we think legitimacy crisis is happening. One is the level. So if a lot of citizens lack support, there's little legitimacy. So for example, if 80% of citizens say that they don't trust political parties, there might be a problem with political parties, right? So the level is an indication. The duration is also, if you look at Italy, for example, okay, the past 30 years, trust in political parties has been extremely low. Well, you know, there's an indication that the system is not able to solve this dissatisfaction or to solve this problem, so it might be more problematic. And the third is the trend. Regardless of which level we are, if support is declining over time, this might signal a legitimacy problem. And that's, for example, a trend we see in Australia, where political support is still pretty high, but it's declined from even higher, so you could see that as a problem. Now, most research on legitimacy decline assumes a trend of long-term decline of political support across established democracies. So Russell Dalton's work, for example, claims across established democracies in the past 30 years, we see this long-term decline of trust, long-term decline of satisfaction with democracy, long-term decline of political support, basically. And most of the theories explaining legitimacy crisis focus on this idea of long-term decline. Now let's see to what extent the empirical data match that. So legitimacy, when it's measured as political support, as most of you probably know, is measured at these four levels, right? The level of the political community, the demos, the political system, in this case democracy, political institutions, and political authorities. And these are the indicators that are most often used. So as you can see, it's only at the level of the political regime that there is a bit of a distinction made between principles and performance, so the ideal versus real. But even there, we rarely ever ask people what they actually think democracy should be, so it doesn't give us that much information. But basically, I'm just going to go with the indicators that we have, however imperfect they are. Support for the political community is measured as national pride. Support for the political regime, often as satisfaction with the functioning of democracy. Then we have trust in regime institutions, and satisfaction with the performance or trust in the national government or the prime minister, etc. So what we did in the book was to start with, let's map the empirical evidence on political support for an as long as possible period in established democracies. So we got 15 European democracies for which we have long-term data, the EU 15 plus the US, from the mid-1970s to the present. We decided to go with comparative cross-national data sets because national election studies often don't use the same indicators. So the advantage of comparative data sets is obviously they ask the same questions across all countries. And the three that had data going back in time longest were Eurobarometer, World European Value Surveys, and the European election studies. And we complement that for the US. That's the only exception we make where we do look at the national election studies because the US is very often not included, and we did want to make that comparison. So we look at this evidence in the book. Just a little note, these are the indicators that we look at. So we focused with the institutions and the representative institutions, because the argument is often that there's a problem with representation. And this is important to take into consideration, and if we look back in time, it is actually really hard to study declining political support before the 1980s, because we have very little data on what's going on. So only for satisfaction with democracy we have data from 1973, and for most other levels it starts much later, which is important if, for example, as Russell Dalton has said in more recent publications, it seems likely that if there was a decline in political support, it may have happened mostly in the 1950s and the 1960s, which would explain why we don't pick that up with these data. But let's have a look at the empirical evidence. So, universal decline across established democracies. That's the story, right? That we hear often about legitimacy. If that's the case, what we should see is across all these 16 democracies, lines that go down over time. So this is national pride, pretty straight for most countries, and pretty high. Satisfaction with democracy. This shows most clearly the variety between countries, right? Again, no universal trend. I don't see lines going down here, at least not in all countries. We do see, of course, the decline in Greece and in Spain and in Italy, and to a lesser extent in Ireland, coinciding with the global financial crisis. We see a more long-term decline in Portugal, but actually satisfaction with democracy goes up in Luxembourg, it goes up in the Netherlands, it goes up in Denmark, it goes up in Sweden. So clearly this is not universal decline. Trust in parliament then? Also not. So it goes down in some countries, but it goes up in other countries, and in other countries it's varying. Trust in political parties? Also not. It's pretty low in some countries, in most countries actually, but it doesn't seem to go down very clearly in all countries. Rather, again, in some countries it goes up, in other countries it squiggles, and yes, in some countries it does go down. And the same picture, you get the gist of the argument. So if there was a universal decline in the past 3 decades, we should have found other data, right? We should have found at least in one of these indicators sort of clear patterns of lines going down, and we don't. So what's going on there? And just as a check, I just had a look at the updating the satisfaction with democracy data until 2017 to see what has happened in the countries most affected by the GFC. And as you can see, Greece recovered, Ireland recovered, Portugal recovered really strongly, Spain is starting to recover, Italy is starting to recover, Greece is still really low, huh? But at least even in the places where we saw decline going until 2015, we now see a bounce back. If the world is on fire, then it's really strange that we find this kind of data, I would say. But yeah, so we'll get back to that later. And this is Australia from Sarah's report with Ian McAllister, where yes, in Australia there has been a decline in satisfaction with democracy. But again, as you see, it might be part of a fluctuating trend rather than a long-term trend, depending on what is causing this development in Australia. So in the book, we test these trends as well. We test whether these trends are significant over time, and we find that especially at the higher levels of political support, so national pride and satisfaction with democracy increases in the majority of established democracies. We do find trust in parliament, political parties, and trust in government to decrease in the majority of countries. This is mostly driven by this last decade of data. So not by a decline prior to the GFC, and as I showed, we see this bouncing back. So we conclude, well, there's no consistent evidence for declining political support, at least not for this period that we cover. So it might be that there was a decline than it was before the period that we're seeing. So rather than a clear-cut long-term decline, we see large variation between countries, both in the levels of political support as well as in the trends of political support over time. So that notion of a universal long-term decline is not supported by empirical data. So what does that mean? That means that we do have to have a look at what's wrong with theories of legitimacy decline, because most theories speaking about legitimacy and political support presume this trend of long-term decline, right? Modernization, increasing levels of education, increasing post-materialist values clearly have made citizens in established democracies more critical. That's based on an assumption that there is this decline in political support. So the second part of this book looks at how valid those theories predicting legitimacy decline are in the face of this empirical data. And we look at 5 theories. We look at modernization, globalization, media malaise, social capital, and party decline. So important theories trying to explain declining political support. I won't discuss them in depth, I'll just go through them in a couple of slides now, but each chapter covers those theories and tries to find out where maybe they might be flawed. And then the third part of the book looks at, well, if we have variation between countries, can we explain that variation with different kind of theories? What kind of theories would account for that variation? Okay, so the second part of the book, really quickly. What's wrong with theories of legitimacy decline? Well, basically, what we say is all of these theories of legitimacy decline, they assume a macro-level connection between something happening in society and then this long-term decline in political support, right? So if this doesn't happen, before I go there, sorry. So, for example, you have increasing levels of education as modernization presumes, and you have cultural value change as modernization presumes at the aggregate level in society, and that leads to a lot more citizens being critical citizens, so declining political support. And the reason why we think there is this connection is because there is a micro-level causal mechanisms linking the two. So the micro-level causal mechanism in this case would be that higher educated people are less satisfied with democracy, for example, and that post-materialist people would be less satisfied with democracy. So if this doesn't happen, 2 things can be wrong. Either that development didn't occur in society, or this link doesn't work for some reason. So each of these chapters traces out which of the one it is, right? Whether A is not happening or whether C is not happening. These are the results, and if you want to read in depth, please go to the book. Sorry, I can't cover all of it. But briefly, if we look at modernization and globalization, the macro level development absolutely occurred. So modernization assumes, it's a complex theory, but it assumes at least 3 things. Income levels rose, education levels rose, and people are increasingly post-materialist in their values. All of those things we find in these 16 democracies that we look at. Is the macro level explanatory theory valid? No. So we find, in fact, that people with more post-materialist values, with higher education and with higher income, are more supportive of democracy rather than less, as the theory would assume. Globalization, did it occur? Of course it occurred, we all know that, and we also show that with an index of globalization. Is the micro-level explanatory theory valid? Again, no, but I highlighted it because there's a little caveat there. So globalization theory argues that the losers of globalization, the most vulnerable people in society, would be less supportive of democracy because they're increasingly under pressure. We find actually, so we test this with looking at education levels as a proxy for where you are in society, and we find actually that both lower educated and higher educated have increasing levels of satisfaction with democracy over time. So also the lower educated become more satisfied with democracy over time, which is really surprising, but the gap grows. The gap between the higher and the lower educated grows. So that's why I highlighted it, because we don't confirm it, but there's a bigger story there that we need to look at again. For social capital and party decline, we do find a connection actually with how active you are in civil society organizations and whether you feel connected to political parties with your political support. So in this case, the micro level theory is valid, but it seems that the macro level trend is not as much supported by empirical data. So there's rather a change in the way people engage with civil society organizations and political parties rather than an outright decline of those organizations. And media malaise is mixed. And for detail, please have a look at the chapters. So then the third part of the book looks at what new explanations, or what existing explanations, but basically what explanations can account for variation in legitimacy, both over time and between countries. And there we look at more macro level explanations, right? We look at input, so the type of institutions that allow for more or less citizen input. We look at output side, economic performance and the quality of governance, so quality of governance being the impartiality of institutions and levels of corruption. And we also look at throughput, which is more or less how governments deal with policy controversies and how they communicate with citizens in that process. These are the results of that. Again, I won't take you through in detail, but what is interesting is that we find, in line with other studies, that institutions tend to have only weak effects on political support, possibly because they're further back in the causal chain. But what that does mean is that we have to temper our enthusiasm for institutional reform maybe a little bit. It might not be the key intervention to strengthen political support. For economic performance, I think the findings are quite interesting, which is there's this whole debate on the political support literature of the effect of economic performance, right? There's a lot of studies that find no effect, other studies that find a strong effect. And we find that it seems to be mediated by the quality of government. So if you live in a high quality of government country, economic performance affects political support much less strongly than it does in a low quality of government country. So in Sweden, for example, the economy can go like this, and people remain relatively supportive. In Greece, if the economy goes like this, or in Italy, political support is much more effective. There's also a strong main effect of quality of government on political support, and this is, I love this chapter because it looks in changes in political support over time responding to a policy controversy at the local level. Okay. I'm trying to say a lot in this presentation. Sorry if it's too much. You can ask me a question afterwards. Just summarizing, and then I'll pile up the questions that I have. So if we look at these data, we don't find a long-term decline of political support in established democracies. We find variation in the levels and in the trends. We do find a recent decline in conjunction with the GFC in some democracies, but looking at more recent data, it seems support is recovering. So what are the implications for explanatory theories of legitimacy decline? Does that mean that individual characteristics are not important for political support? Well, I would say no, but maybe we need to move away from the sweeping theories a little bit and go into the detail and have a look at what is the relative importance of individual characteristics versus input and output factors. What are the macro-micro interactions? So are particular groups of citizens affected particularly strongly by economic performance or the level of performance of institutions, or being shut out from representative institutions because there's no party representing their interests, for example? So could it be that legitimacy problems are cumulative, that it's a combination of disadvantage plus economic crisis plus lack of representation, which then leads to declining political support for a particular group of citizens? And then there's the question of levels versus change. So could it be that the trends that we see are actually caused by a relatively small proportion of the electorate that is actually attentive or affected by macro level developments, whereas a large chunk of citizens are quite stable in their support and don't respond to, we don't know this. And of course a remaining question is, for those people who have low political support, what are the consequences? Do they withdraw? Do they protest? Do they support alternatives to democracy? And we have increasing evidence on that, but I don't think we've got all the answers there. So, caveats, and then I'll close off. It felt really weird to do this book when everyone is proclaiming that the world is on fire, to then go and say, yeah, but you know, the empirical data doesn't quite show this. So what's happening here? What's happening? It could be, I've come to two answers potentially, but I'd like to hear what you think about that. One thing that could be happening is, of course, that we are completely missing what's going on with the data that we're using, which would be really problematic because we've been using this data for over 40 years now, right? But it could be that indeed we're missing real developments in society, and that when people say they're satisfied with democracy, there's a whole lot of other things going on that we're actually not tapping into with our surveys. So a few of these things are, for example, ideal versus real. Could it be that people say they're satisfied with democracy, but actually they, if they're permitted, they would go for a different kind of political system, or they have an idea of what democracy means that is completely different from what it is now. So do we know what kind of political system citizens want? Could it be that democratic belief systems are more complex than what we understand now? We know that it could very well be possible that people are supportive of democracy and at the same time like strong leaders, and at the same time think that, you know, it would be good to curtail civil liberties so that at least we can go be efficient and do good decision making. So it's entirely possible that citizens hold both authoritarian and democratic preferences. And one thing that was instructive for me, that's a third argument actually, discretion over national policy making, is we did focus groups in the Netherlands, and then we had citizens saying, yeah, no, we're really satisfied with democracy. We think, you know, the system works really well. We just don't think it's where the decisions are being made. So, where it is, well, you know, at the EU level and companies make decisions. And this was not one person, this was consistent across the focus group. So, yeah, then you can get really high scores on satisfaction with democracy, but people think democracy is quite inconsequential. So, yeah, we're probably missing a lot with the data that we're using. So the challenge is developing better data. Or the other question is, are we in a sort of collective groupthink as academics, where we're overgeneralizing based on specific cases, specific countries, Syriza, Podemos, Trump, Brexit, those, you know, are we overgeneralizing based on very few cases to conclude that, oh my God, something really dramatic is going on? And are we perhaps reading these developments, such as protest and support for extreme left and right parties, as crisis, whereas maybe they're rather an indicator of renewal? Maybe they're rather bringing previously unrepresented interests into the representative system. So think of the social movements period of the 1970s. People also thought that, oh my God, all these hippies and these green parties, and they're all gaining power and going into parliament, the world's going to crumble. Well, it didn't quite crumble, you know. So are we maybe reading the world a little bit too extreme? That's all, I think.